Hello. So, as I promised, or as we discussed last week, I'm not sure I actually made a promise, I wanted to do the discussions of for week 5 and 6 together because this is war and trade, and the two kind of go hand in hand. Um, the question, of course, of whether each one is good or bad depends. In most societies, they are both, but it depends a lot on which society you're talking about and where you are in that society. Um, if you're wealthy and powerful, they can both be beneficial. If, however, you are one of the average people in society, which is about 90% of any of the societies we're talking about today, they were both very detrimental. Sorry. This is why you're getting this video, because when I talk, I cough. All right, so who's the average person in each society? The first thing you have to define, of course, is average, and for our purposes, that is ordinary or usual. The ordinary or usual person in any civilization would be those who make up the largest group, and this is a pretty good triangle of the social hierarchy of most ancient civilizations. At the very top, you're going to have your king or your emperor and his administrators. Then you're going to have the priests for the various religions. The ones that are going to be most important are going to be the ones that are part of the state-sponsored religions. Then you're going to have the nobility, who are usually people who have been delegated to assist the king. And in most situations, they become permanent, as in their families become permanent and the position is hereditary and passes to the oldest male son. You'll have government officials who are the bureaucrats who do the things or affect the things that the kings want. Then you have your merchants and farmers who are usually on the same scale. In most of these early civilizations that we're talking about, particularly the ancient ones, merchants are traditionally disdained. And in fact, while they do manage to be the middlemen in the production of goods in some societies, for instance, China, they are considered to be worse than a farmer because in Chinese culture, merchants were considered inferior because they didn't produce anything. All they did was profit off of the work of others. The very lowest level, of course, was going to be slaves. And if the society needed more slaves, that became a justification for war, because in every war, the losers would be enslaved and their land would be taken. So food production was basically the foundation of all ancient, classical, and early modern societies. Pretty much every society we're going to talk about in this course. The majority of people were involved in the production of food, whether they were free or slave. If they were free, they might have been a farmer, a herder, a fisherman, a hunter. And as I said, sometimes merchants, because the first merchants were people who were basically exchanging foodstuffs for other people's. Much of the production went into feeding the family unit. Some of it went to the payment of taxes. And then if there was any left, it could be exchanged for other commodities, which is where local trade begins. Rarely was enough produced for profit, because this is, again, mostly subsistence living. The disadvantages in war. Taxes went up when a society was at war. Farmers and other average men could be forced to serve and die in the military, leaving their families understaffed, and often leading to the failure of the family farm or whatever, or the family itself, literally, because they couldn't produce enough food to feed themselves. Arable land was often the reason for war, in which case the average person could find themselves to be slaves. And what we mean by this is that many wars, particularly during the ancient civilizations, but also going into the classical period, were caused by the need for more land to produce more food. And probably one of the best examples of this is Rome, which we're going to be seeing here in the classical civilization period, because the Romans were almost persistently at war. Definitely after they made the transition from republic to empire, but even before, during the republic period itself, One of the things that led to the collapse of the Republic was this infighting between generals themselves, who ultimately end up marching on Rome. And one of the reasons they're fighting is they're fighting for power. They're fighting for the control of Rome itself. But they're generals because they've been sent out with their troops into faraway places to conquer more territory, to take more slaves, to have more land, to produce more food. So again, war often the justification um, for the creation of slaves and taking of land. The other thing I think we really need to be aware of when we talk about who this average person was is this average person was what today we would refer to as somebody who was seriously impoverished. They basically had to produce everything for themselves that they needed. They ate what they produced, and unlike today, the vast majority were primarily vegetarians, because if they were fortunate enough to actually own an animal, that animal was something that they needed for work. Cows for plowing, sheep for making wool, chickens for eggs. All of these things were, you didn't kill these animals until they were too old to do whatever it was that you needed for them to do. And when you did, that was normally around a feast day or around some celebratory moment where you would be sharing that meat with others, because they didn't have refrigerators to keep things, from spoiling. So meat was a rarity in almost all ancient, classical, and even post-classical civilizations in most households. It is something that the wealthy or the elite might eat often, but for the most part, the average person did not. When we talk about this idea of women keeping the house, it literally took them all day to produce one meal. They had no grocery stores, there were no takeout places. Everything they did by hand, and they did it by an open fire, basically. And this meant that with the grains, because we've been talking about like wheat and corn and things like that, they had to literally process them into some form of flour, which meant milling them. They would break them down. They would figure out the combinations to make some form of bread. Bread was the mainstay of almost every diet in some capacity, which they would bake on that open fire. And then they would eat it fresh for dinner, and whatever remained would be served the next day for both breakfast and the midday meal if there was enough. So basically, they spent all day working on one meal, and that meal had to get them through the next day as well. They had to make the cloth for clothes. Everything was hand woven at this point in time. There were no factories. There was no spinning machine, no big spinning machines. They had little spinning things. But everything they wore, every cloth that they used in the house, carpets for the floor, diapers for the babies, cleaning rags, all of those things were things that they literally made themselves. So when we talk about women keeping the house, what we really mean is that she spent, and her daughters and any other woman living in the house, spent their entire day literally doing work to keep the family together. And this it's not like today. You didn't just go out and buy something and then sit around for 6 hours having fun. This was constant, and it was work from sun up until sundown. They worked almost every day. The exceptions were normally religious holidays, which most societies had regularly in order to keep the people from becoming too despondent. Most people lived in the family unit. And in the ancient classical civilizations, in fact, actually up until transatlantic slavery, slaves also lived in family units. Slavery was not usually a form of dehumanization. In the ancient world and in the classical and post-classical civilizations, there was the understanding that slaves were humans. You needed them to do things. So they had certain, I don't want to say rights, because they weren't per se rights, but there were certain expectations, of which was that slaves could marry, they could have children. The status of being a slave in almost all societies did not pass to their children. Almost all slaves had the option to do extra work to make money to buy their way out of slavery and to buy their family's way out of slavery if they had married someone who was a slave as well. Most people had a very limited diet, as we talked about in the discussion of the transition from hunter-gatherer to agrarian. That's going to limit the diet very much. It's pretty much limited to what they themselves could produce. And again, meat was a rarity and it was very expensive. The average life expectancy was 35 to 40 years old. Infant mortality was as high as 30%. And one of the leading causes of death for women was childbirth itself. And that's going to remain the case up until effectively the 1800s. So it was a really hard life if you were living in this period. And the other thing that we tend to forget, especially today, since our lives change week to week, literally, is that most of these people were living the same lives that their grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-great-grandparents, and so forth, all the way back, had lived. It's really not until around the 1500s that things begin to shift towards what many of you use as a descriptor, toward progress. It's one of those words I hate because it doesn't really mean anything. You have to totally put it into context. In the case that I'm using it, what I mean is that people's lives begin to change because things begin to get better for them. The standard of living begins to raise, and they can begin to look forward to things getting better and thus changing. And that really doesn't start happening until the early modern world. With trade, most trade was local, but as the empires grew, they began to have more contact with places farther away, so products became different, more exotic. Silk and other fabrics, spices, animals, weapons, technology, these sorts of things began to come from further and further away. But again, they don't make it to the common man. It's pretty much only the elites in any society that are wealthy enough to have the money to be able to buy them. Thus, you had basically a limited market size geared to the elite. Most of the commodities are high value commodities, but again, way too expensive for the average person to be able to afford. When there was water availability, you could move bulk commodities, which could be moved by boats. And by this, we mean grain, wine, olive oil. Some of those might have trickled down to the lower classes, but not often. And there are many intermediaries. And what this basically means is that, as you've been reading in Frankopan, the Silk Road was not one trading route. It was numerous trading routes that overlapped, and very few people started at one end and went to the other. Instead, it was a number of different, while the goods moved from one end to the other, they did it by way of being bought and sold numerous times by numerous people and to numerous people. So every time that got bought and sold, the value of them goes up, or the price on them goes up. Okay, factors that limited trade, limited capacity and speed of inland or overland transportation. That was particularly expensive, especially when you're looking at crossing many of the deserts or the high mountainous areas across central Eurasia. Diversity of currents and units of measure. There was not a uniform system of currency, nor a uniform size system. It was not like today when you can go in the grocery store and buy an 8-ounce can of tomato paste or a 16-ounce can of beans. There was not a standardized unit for measurement. So this made it problematic. There were very high tariffs, which meant that if you were bringing a product into an area, well, you should know what tariffs are. We are having the whole issue of tariffs today. These are duties on imported goods designed specifically to make the buyer pay a portion to the state. So, and of course, as goods are moving from place to place, every king wants his cut. Every emperor wants his 2 or 3 cuts. So yeah, that's going to make it much higher. Unreliable navigation. If you're trying to do it over water in order to cut out some of those tariffs, there's the problem of not being able to figure out either where you are or being able to land in a port because of obstructions or bad weather, which sinks a ship. And then insecurity and piracy. Piracy being chronic, both overland and on the water. Caravans were often raided by people who wanted the goods in order to steal them and sell them themselves. The same thing is true on the water. You're always going to have people trying to take what you have. So yeah, these were problems for merchants and for the elite. All right, war, one of the main causes of war, again, to acquire more territory, to produce more food, to acquire more slaves to do the hard work that no one else wants to do, whether it be agriculture or, in a minority sense, mining or the building of pyramids or the moving of big stones or whatever. The winners of the war benefited from having new lands to claim, and most of those would be the wealthy, who would control the land and profit from what was produced on it. The society as a whole benefited by having more resources, though it would take a long time for that benefit to trickle down to the common man, usually generations. And of course, in the immediate generation, many of the common men would be dead because they would be the cannon fodder, once there were cannons, or they would be the arrow fodder or the spear fodder or whatever at the beginning of the battle. Losers in a war were killed or became slaves, or, if lucky, continued life as it had been before, but now they paid taxes to a new ruler and usually had to pay more because they were now considered to be the losers of the war. And of course, slavery. The real losers in both trade and war were slaves. They were a highly valued commodity because nobody wanted to do a lot of this hard work, so you got slaves to do that. Slaves were created by conquest or by debt. If they could not support themselves and their families, they were often sold into what is called debt bondage. Every society in the ancient, classical, post-classical world wanted more slaves, and this will continue into the early modern period. I love this particular quote from Carland. It's estimated, for instance, that Julius Caesar, in his conquest of Gaul, enslaved nearly 500,000 people, and each one of them was an individual. It's probably fair to state that there were as many enslaved people living in the Roman Empire as there were free people. And what the Romans did was no different, other than in scale, from what the Mesopotamians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, and others did. This was just the nature of life in this period. Slavery was a part of what you were going to deal with. All right, so here's your historiography. Since, as I pointed out, historiography is a big part of this, how we tell the story of history and how the telling of that story changes. Today, trade and war have long reputations for benefiting societies. Our modern view of capitalism certainly leads us to think that trade is overall beneficial. Certainly it does. We tend to ignore the people who are hurt by both. And I think now more than ever, it's important to understand as we look at the wars that are going on today, some of which many of you have thought about using as the basis for your final projects. As we look at issues of trade and tariffs and the things that are going on in our own society. In the ancient and classical civilizations, trade and war created more slaves and more taxes. The common man saw little benefit from either because quite often, if he was not someone who was enslaved, then he was forced to pay more taxes. The story of history has mostly been told from the position of the elite, wealthy, powerful, those that we think of as the great men of history or the great man history, because those are the people who left the written records. Certainly in the time period we're studying, where basically maybe 10% of the population could read and write, then definitely it's going to be that group of people who are telling us what was going on. Only now, with the help of archaeology, are we seeing more of the history of the common man. And it shows a much more complicated picture. And a lot of that picture has to do with the problems that people had because of trade and war. So think about these things as we go into it. This next round of things. Here are the sources that I use for this. Frankopan obviously is talking a lot about trade, seeing a lot of the benefits from it, but even he will tell you, as you've undoubtedly noticed by now, that it really is of benefit to the elite. And while it does increase the standard of living and begins the creation of things like a middle class, that middle class is still very small. And it's very easy to fall out of the middle class back into the bottom class, or the bottom free class, and sometimes even the bottom slave class, because if you are a merchant and you go into debt and you don't have the ability to pay off that debt, then you will be sold into slavery as part of the debt bondage system. All right, so that's what we were going to talk about today. If you have questions, feel free to email me or ask me on Wednesday. Hopefully I'll be able to talk by then. Otherwise, I am working on catching up on the grading. Yeah, I know I say it all the time, but it is happening because, we're getting up close to the midterms. So if you have questions, please let me know.